Recording. Chiara, possiamo andare con lo streaming. Se mi dai l'ok, cominciamo.
Qui Chiara.
Chiara. Ok. Buongiorno a tutti. Scusate. Buongiorno a tutti e cominciamo questa giornata del European Bauhaus. È una giornata intensa, anche e soprattutto perché sapete molto bene, si sta svolgendo anche Wave tra il cotonificio e i magazzini. Oggi appunto ci sovrapponiamo con grande piacere anche a questo evento Iuav, e abbiamo quindi più eventi. Vedete dal sito Iuav che oggi avremo tre conferenze. È un grande piacere, chiaramente possiamo anche ampliare sicuramente la discussione che stiamo portando avanti in queste settimane con degli ospiti che vengono da tutto il mondo in realtà, ma anche, e ne siamo molto contenti, con degli amici e dei colleghi dello Iuav. Oggi li vedrete nei vostri schermi. Abbiamo Marco Ballarin, Daniele Ruggeri e la professoressa Fernanda De Maio, che partecipano a questa discussione con Marianne Krogh, curatrice del Padiglione Danese alla Biennale. È un grandissimo piacere, e quindi lascio subito loro la parola e procediamo con questa prima comunicazione. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Jacopo. I would explain. Allora, vorrei spiegare agli studenti che io parlerò in inglese, farò una breve introduzione in inglese perché la nostra ospite è un ospite danese e ci farà la presentazione in inglese. So, it's a pleasure to introduce you Marianne Krogh today as part of this cycle of talks dedicated to the new European Bauhaus and to the design of the concept of the new European Bauhaus. I met Marianne through the Danish Pavilion. I didn't know her before, no? And it was a very nice surprise to know that she was at the Iuav. She was invited by Marco De Michelis, that at that time was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and that she was invited by him to visit and to have a conference here probably. So we meet again, and I appreciate very much her works in the Danish Pavilion for some reason that I would like to explain, because first of all, the title of the pavilion, no? Connectedness. I think that this title not only expresses the concepts of circularity starting from water, which perhaps will be part of her lecture today. For me, visiting the pavilion, this title meant above all a great work of ideas around the basic concepts of this Biennale, whose title is How Will We Live Together? Come vivremo insieme, no? And what I appreciate very much was the way in which she, as a curator, worked very with the architects who make the design of the pavilion. The architects are very famous architects in Denmark. They are Lundgaard and Tramberg. And I would say that perhaps the most seductive and intriguing aspect of the lesson of the pavilion that led me to point out for this series of lectures dedicated to a new concept of design, Marianne Krogh, is the way in which the pavilion creates a link between nature and architecture, not only through pipes, elements, materials, spaces, but also through the construction of actions that will be created by the gentle hand, I would say, the gentle sign of the architecture. Because I think that too often we, as architects, feel ourselves such as the rulers of space, those who best know how to control the space, no? In part, I can say that this is true, but without a correct approach to participatory actions, we as architects, designers, urban planners, run the risk of locking ourselves in a sort of fence, no? Like animals in a circus or in a zoo. The lessons and the precise and tender gaze that comes from Northern Europe and from the Danish pavilion, I think that can help us from the south of Europe to find the right route through this new paradigm of the European Bauhaus. For this reason, I think I decide to propose Jacopo, Marco, and all the young architects who are organizing WAVE and the European Bauhaus think tank to invite Marianne Krogh. And I thank her very much for accepting the invitation. So I only give her the floor in the name of the new European Bauhaus motto, Form Follows the Planet. Thank you, Marianne. It's up to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the nice words and for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Marianne Krogh, and I work as a curator and also as a book editor within the field of contemporary architecture and art. As an art historian with a PhD in architecture, I have constantly been trying to identify various ways of conceptualizing architectural space with inspiration from philosophy, sociology, anthropology, social sciences, literature, visual arts, etc. My work is how to push these notions and experiences into different forms of outcome. This could be as architectural form, as verbalizations and dialogues, as books and as exhibitions. And I will show you some examples of this, as my current research is based on this idea of entanglement and connectedness, and the investigations of various forms that this can take, each with its own quality. And the latest example is the exhibition in the Danish Pavilion in the Biennale, which is on view now. And I will introduce that in a few minutes. But let me start by sharing some images with you and telling you a little bit about the background of the project. So, let me see. So can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Good. In the summer of 2019, I attended a protest march in Copenhagen in favor of an area in the city called Amagerfællet. And fællet means a common, and it's one of the last areas in the capital that it hasn't been appropriated by developers, not even by city landscape gardeners. It is so-called wild, not designed, and it's an area that many Copenhageners hold very dearly. It's very close to the city center. And of course, the various mayors and developers have had their eyes on this spot for a long time, seeing it as an empty space for housing and revenue. The march started in front of the town hall, and among the speakers was the author Josephine Klogaard, who read a text about how to think about the constellation, culture, and nature. And it was a very beautiful and poetic text. And her main point was that a viable way forward in the shadow of the climate crisis should not be found outside ourselves. That means focusing on technical and practical solutions regarding carbon emission, pollution, technologies, etc. But instead to turn the gaze towards ourselves, our thinking and feelings as living creatures, as earthlings in an entangled and very complex world. And this is not to say that we should not work on solutions, but an important starting point is a much deeper feeling about our own situation and role in a larger context. If we can feel, sense, and conceptualize a deep connectedness with everything around us, especially the so-called nature, we would understand that what we are doing to the biosphere, plants, animals, air, water, geological formations, and so on, we are also doing to ourselves. We are deeply connected, and any abuse is ultimately an abuse to ourselves. So when I heard this, I thought that here is something really important and very inspiring. It of course applies to the classical and modernistic culture-nature relationship, but it can fuel a wide range of structures and notions in our modern society. Just think about how we are entangled in extremely complex global and often invisible networks in our daily life. For example, just going to the grocery store in Manchester to buy bacon is an act which is intertwined with global transportation, farms and industries in Denmark, all the way to Brazil, where deforestation is taking place in order to produce corn for pigs. And I thought this was also extremely important in connection with architecture as an endeavor and an industry which taps into and create all these global invisible networks. But also as a spatial practice, which has a huge and cultural deep impact on the life of everything on the globe. And I have to say, I do not see this as a romantic impulse. You know, if you can just feel the connection with nature, then everything will be peaceful and balanced. But rather as a feeling to practice, and which is something that will also reveal difficulties, dilemmas, conflicts, and even pain, but something that needs to be revealed. And also in the context of the Anthropocene and the climate crisis, there is so much talking about that problem of knowing about the crisis and its consequences, but not being able to feel them, or having a bodily experience of them, you could say. And here lies a potential with architecture. So this point, this experience, and this feeling of connectedness, you could say, is something that I took as a point of departure for the architectural exhibition in the Venice Biennale in the Danish Pavilion. I'm sorry, I have to, here it is. I approached an architectural studio in Copenhagen called Lundgaard & and they have done some quite important work in the capital. But this was not about their objects, so to speak, but about their, I feel, eminent capacity to work with the physical spaces in a phenomenological way, where focus is on movement, process, pulse, and so on. This is what we could call a denominator for all life. And life is where we are all connected. I asked them if they, together with me, would make an exhibition which, first of all, had the idea of connectedness as a starting point. And two, if they could use the pavilion as the actual exhibited space and not just a container for something else. Here's a drawing of the pavilion. And I also told them that I would like to redefine habitual ways to make architecture exhibitions. Very often you show models, you have big graphics on the wall with a lot of explanatory text, etc. And I was not so interested in this, since we had to focus on the knowing and feeling instead of just knowing. And I wanted to fight the representational aspect. The actual thing is here. We are not pointing at the real thing somewhere outside. This is a picture from a previous exhibition in the Danish Pavilion. And I just show it because this is sort of the typical example of an architecture exhibitions with a lot of information to read, a lot of objects to move around and study. And I wanted to challenge the idea of forefront and background, spatial hierarchies, and the taking in of information. And this resulted in a very long series of workshops with the architects over many, many months. And where we invited a lot of guests who could present their work with connectedness, be it the natural sciences, art, agriculture, psychology, food, and so on. Because nothing is outside, so to speak, and everything taps into something else. And here we see what this long process turned into. A pavilion that taps into the global circulation of water. Except for some very small amounts of water that enter our atmosphere from cosmos, then all the water which is here on our planet has always been here. It runs, it drops, it freezes, it melts, etc., but always in cycles. It carries time, geography, memory, disaster, and hope. Rain is collected from the roof and is let into the pavilion as an architectural element, you could say, through tubes, as streams on the floor, through fabrics, with a floating platform, making dripping noises and different intensities of humidity. Along its way, it waters local herbs, which is collected and dried and eventually served as tea for the visitors, letting the water also run through the inside of the guests, and in the end back into the global cycles. Here we see some pictures from the small garden behind the pavilion, where we have sort of the center of the water system. We collect the water from the roof and store it in the garden, and it's also clean there before it's let into the pavilion. And here you see how the tubes enter the pavilion, and this is how the water gets inside the exhibition. Along its way, the water is dispersed in three different directions. One of them is that it's going to this space the Krogh space is called, where the water is dripping through a big white cloth hanging from the ceiling. And this is also sort of a very atmospheric space where you hear the water, you can feel the water, you can even smell is also activated here because of the water going through the material. And there's a very interesting and very sort of atmospheric and shifting light in the space as well. Another direction of the water is going to the other side, where it is watering the local herbs, which is growing here and which we use to making tea of. And then finally it goes into the big space, the Brommer Hall it's called, where the water comes out into the big basin. And here's a floating platform, and from which you can go into the niches and sit down. And eventually the water flows over, of course, and it goes onto the ground in the pavilion and back through the pavilion, floating on the floor in a stream, and back into the tanks in the garden behind the pavilion. And then again, it starts its circulation. So it's an ongoing, eternal circulation, you could say, getting its source from the rainwater outside. The exhibition is not a closed system. It is truly intertwined with the outside conditions, so that when there is heavy rain, the water will be more potent and powerful inside. And likewise, you will feel inside when it hasn't been raining for a long time. The inside and outside is connected, and the border between the outside world and the pavilion is more a matter of intensities than of an opposition between reality and representation. And this is why we have this sentence at the entrance of the exhibition, saying that the world is one cyclic system which we all create together. It's very important to say that this is not a space where we propose this is where circulation exists, because circulation is everywhere, of course. And in a way, we sort of focus on that or highlight that in the exhibition, but they are truly and deeply connected. The local herbs are thyme, lemon, verbena, and lavender, and many more. And they grow along water channels and in wet areas in the outskirts of Venice. And it's not a cafe where you get a cup of tea. You could say that the guests are co-hosts, as they are also able to help pick the leaves and engage with the hosts in grinding and making the tea. Visitors are also part of the smaller and bigger cycles and are invited into a deeper engagement in the exhibition. The water system, that is the collecting of the rainwater, which is led through pipes and channels, is also sand clean in our reservoir before it's led into the building. And again, when it returns to the small garden. You can see here the blue machine is where it gets sand cleaned. And this mimics something which has been going on in Venice for many centuries. Because of its location, it has been, for many centuries, difficult for Venice to get clean and fresh drinking water. And thus, every square, or almost square in the city, has holes in the corners where rainwater enters the ground and then led through an area of sand where it gets cleaned and then gathered in a well in the middle of the square. So you could say that in this exhibition, it's the same method, but interpreted with the use of modern technology. Our work and processes along the way have touched upon a series of themes, focus points, investigations, and questions. And I just want to mention a few of them here. In order to make visible how things are connected, for better and for worse, we need to describe our world. So much in our world is disguised and invisible. This can be said about our technology, and this can certainly be said about architecture, as in production methods, transportation, working force, demolishment, etc. Just scratch the outer surface of the wall of any modern building, and you will be surprised what you will find behind it. So here in this exhibition, we concentrate on being explicit about the technology and even inviting it in a playful manner. Another point is, there is no clear divide between humans and technology, excuse me, between nature and culture, and so on. The lines are blurry, do not exist, or get shifting over and over again, depending on who has the perspective. In our work, we have been very inspired by the notion of the critical zone. First, it was a term used in the natural sciences, but now quite commonly used in many different areas. And the critical zone is that thin layer around our planet in which everything takes place. This is where life is. It's very, very thin. It's just a couple of kilometers up in the air where the atmosphere shifts, and a few hundred meters into the ground, depending on vegetation, the deep sea, minerals, and other resources. It's very, very thin, and everything takes place in there, deeply entangled in each other, with a kind of stickiness, you could say. Take one component away, and then everything else will eventually collapse. We inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide for others to live. And in our work, we have found this a very powerful imagery, especially for two reasons. First, it prevents us from thinking of ourselves as something outside of our surroundings. We are deeply intertwined. And second, it questions the idea of space as a neutral, passive container. In this way, you could say that space does not pre-exist. It is constantly created in a complex, interconnected, and mutual network of relations. In this way, we need to redescribe our territories. We have also been very interested in the notion of care. Care for a broken planet, care for all earthlings, and care for the visitor and everything else. The whole notion of considering this research of Lynn Margulis, for example, regarding evolution through symbiosis and coexistence, by association and not by exclusion or survival. That is something that we have discussed a lot in our sessions. So therefore, we have also tried to use recycled materials, local materials and workforce to care for where the materials go after the end of the exhibition, and in general to shift the direction of our care away from the expensive materials, the object, and towards the care that is given to its presentation in a space that is created with the visitors. The central core of the exhibition is not objects, but the people, life, everything living. So for example, the wood that we use to cover the floating platform in the big space is a wood which was given to us from a gymnastic hall, a floor which they didn't use anymore. And also all the cups that we're using for the tea for the visitors are just cups that we got from the Red Cross and the Blue Cross, and they all come from different private homes, which I think is very nice because they carry so many stories and will now enter into new stories in this exhibition. And again, when the exhibition ends, and we try to redistribute them again. And finally, this is also something which has something to do with the global commons. Water is both strong and delicate commons. And in many parts of the world, there is not enough drinking water. There are floods, ice caps are melting, oceans rising. Just the way we use water in Denmark, for example, the amount and the attitude towards it would require 4 planets if everybody lived that way. And that is, of course, not sustainable. It's a precious commons, deeply political. And on top of that, it appeals to our senses of touch, of sound, of smell, of gaze. And who knows where it has been before. So it opens up as well to our magical capacity to imagine, to hope, to memory and longings. And it stimulates us to think that the world could be in so many ways, not just like this. In a few moments, I will show you a film, a very short one, that I made of the exhibition Connectedness together with a film director. But before I do that, I will briefly touch upon the book that I made in connection with the exhibition and the theme of connectedness. Because these considerations and approaches to a very complex field can, of course, take on many forms. So along the process of developing the exhibition, I also worked on a book in order to investigate all this further. It is connected to the exhibition, but it's also a work in itself with a different form and wider discussions. And making this book, I had to ask the following questions. Have we been too one-sided for far too long in our languages, which we use for describing and comprehending the world? Should the scientific academic approach be accompanied by other kind of approaches and languages? For example, art, poetry, imagery. So for this reason, I also invited, for example, a lot of artists and asked them to make a contribution in a way that made sense to them. Another question is, how can we approach everything connected, so to speak, without flattening everything to being the same? This division between disciplines for decades needs to be questioned in order to embrace what the philosopher Bruno Latour has called the earthly sciences. But at the same time, we still need the deep and professional work and experience that comes from having worked with one discipline for a very long time. So for this reason, I chose the form of the encyclopedia, incomplete, of course, in order to respect the individual professions and at the same time present a gesture of transdisciplinarity. You could call it connectedness by association. And finally, a question is, how can we approach and problematize the notion of borders that so often stagnates ongoing processes, flows, and creativity, not to speak of power and the fight for owning the truth? In the book, there are some pretty influential names, and they are present because their work and thinking is important within the framework of connectedness. But the book is not just these dominant names and theories. I have also asked a bunch of younger PhD students to contribute, and it creates, you could say, a weaving of loud and soft voices. And I have to say, unfortunately, there are not enough voices from the global South, and it would be interesting to make a second volume with more voices from around the world. But this is a very complex question, and also asks about who can speak on whose behalf. I started off with the words that I found important now. There could have been 500 more. And then a messenger or an interpreter was invited to contribute based on that word. Every contribution was giving some keywords and cross-references to the other contributions. So the whole book unfolds as an interconnected work with kind of dialogues across the pages. And in order to point at the weaving network that is or could be a play around the centers of attention. These are just two examples of the alphabet. I will not go into the actual contributions in the book here today, but I can highly recommend that you do it yourself. There are some extremely interesting topics and approaches that are very relevant to architecture and its impact on the world. And it ranges from architecture, bacteria, borders, food, future, coexistence, home, imagination, sensitivity, water, of course, violence, to the next generation, and many, many more. So this is a discussion that needs to go on, and it needs to find different forms and bodies in order to evolve organically with and around the world. It's not so important whether we agree or disagree, but about continuing the questioning, the discussions and curiosity about our surroundings, our role and situation, and about what place architecture has in all this connectedness, you could say, or in what Latour calls the 1,000 folds of Earth. So I finish my little talk here by showing you a small film we did on the exhibition in the Danish Pavilion. It's just 3 minutes long. It places the exhibition in a larger context within the Anthropocene, as well as in the framework of the city of Venice. And then, of course, if you haven't seen it, please go and see the exhibition Connectedness.
Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Hello. Hello.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Well, to start at the beginning, you could say that the reason why Venice is where it is exactly because we have this interaction between the ocean and the rivers and the mountains and the hinterland. So I think that Venice is a very good example of how the balance between the forces that threaten you and on the other way, the forces that sustain you has to be just exactly right.
The human search for meaning and the importance of meaning for our cultural evolution. Earth systems, planetary systems, human systems, whether it's cultural or energy or agricultural or whatever, how they drive planetary systems. They're all interconnected and they feed back on each other.
We can't see many of the things that our life causes other places on the planet. So very many of us live in a little bubble right around ourselves, and we don't recognize that we're part, that we're interconnected, that we're connected to other things.
Well, clearly our impact on nature, on the natural systems, is driven by our desires and not by our needs. If we were only driven by needs, we would have a much, much lesser footprint on the planet.
Venice is a really interesting example of where the human and the non-human are meeting, you know, with the water coming up to the canals and rising water tables and rocks eroding, yet at the same time, that amazing historical venture to build a water city.
Well, this is the time of reckoning, isn't it?
You take a laguna, you have just basically the little mud bank sitting in the middle of it, and some people decide to make the most wonderful city in the earth out of this. And that is, that shows you what humans are. Humans have these aspirations, and they are what brings us into trouble, but it's also those aspirations that will get us out of trouble again.
Humans start by collaborating on things. We're completely dependent on each other. None of us could survive alone. So we depend on our society, but more broadly than that, we depend on strangers, not just our family, not just our group, but strangers in other groups. We've been driven throughout human history since we evolved by this need and this impulse to harness as much energy as we can. We really need to ensure that other life on Earth can also survive. All comes from this one finite planet. We're pushing these systems to such a level that they're not going to be able to support.
Culture is enormously important, and if we're going to have a new relationship, a better relationship with the world around us, we're going to have to be looking at changes in culture.
And the big question, whether we will kind of conquer over nature or whether nature will conquer over us. I think that nature will always win, and then nature will win. I guess maybe the big philosophical question is, when does human activities end and where does nature begin? I think that we are part of nature, and the earlier we realize that nature, that's us, that better will our chances be to extend our time as civilizations on Earth. We should not preserve nature for the sake of nature. We should do it because it's important to us.
Thank you very much. I don't know if very, very much, because I think that for us who were in Venice when I tried arrived, that it was very strong.
Yes.
To see Maria. It was a very strong feeling. But I would like that the youngest architects, such as Daniela, Marco, Jacopo, or the student, can give some comments if they have, please.
I'll start. Marianne, thank you very much. I think it's very interesting, and it's very related to what we are trying to do here with this new European Bauhaus initiative. Our idea starts from this slogan that we came up with, that is Venice Foresees the Planet. Venice has this capacity to anticipate things, to see things ahead. And I think that one of the things that Venice was able to anticipate in its history if this idea of controlling the sum of connections on the territory, being aware that they exist, but also designing them. The Republic went on for centuries out of the idea that it was possible to control the flow of the water on a territorial scale, to control the growth of the trees, to control the transformation of the trees into industries and so on. And I think that what the pandemic condition has shown us is the complete break of this condition of connectedness. The connections have become so big that if we cut one branch, it becomes impossible to reconstruct the whole network. And so I don't know if it's a question, but my concern about this is I see this very clearly as a micro model of something that could be applied on a much larger territorial scale in Denmark, in Italy, wherever around the world. What's your take on this idea of connectedness as an engine for territorial transformation? How do you think that this concept could inform the processes of territorial transformation that we need to be building in the near future?
Well, I think the idea of connection is very, very deep. So in a way, as you said, the pandemic made many of the global connections sort of collapse. So, you know, if you've ruined in some parts and then the other parts collapse and so on. But in a way, these are just systems that we have built up and they can be changed. And this is also why I say that the first step is actually to describe the world and see if things are working in a sustainable and ethical way that we can imagine for the future. So the pandemic breaks down these connections, but in a way the pandemic showed that there is a connectedness which is deeper. We are connected, and this is for better and for worse. In this connection, it was for worse because it has been such a traumatic experience, but these connections are also very invisible and very difficult to control. So I think describing and making visible is first step before moving ahead. And having a wide range of discussions and projects on how are we connected, us and the world around us, and the nature and the habitats and the coexistence with other living creatures. And so if this is something we can feel and develop different languages for, I think we have a way forward instead of just making external solutions in trying to sort of repair what's going wrong right now. And you said this about it could have wider implications in other countries. And so I have actually been asked by many people if I could imagine doing the exhibition in another place in the world. And I would say no and yes. No, because this is an exhibition which has been created for that specific site and that specific context of Venice and that building and everything. So, but yes, because it's an approach that could be repeated in other places, but maybe it shouldn't be water. Maybe could be air in India or something like that. So I think we sort of need not to focus on materials, but approaches and bodily situatedness. I don't know if that's an answer to you.
Well, I make a wish.
Yes, of
Thank
course.
you very much, Marianne. It was really inspiring. And indeed, you already answered to what was my question. That was how the project starts. It starts for Venice specific, how much Venice inspired you and your team, and how much you had already the idea of connectedness with water. But this, I think you already answered me. But just a few curiosity about the project of the pavilion. How many times before you started to work on this? And how many people were involved in your team? If there are some others we don't see in the
colophon. Yes, and of course there have been so many people involved. But very shortly about the process. We started off by taking the train to go and see the pavilion, because that was the starting point, that actual architectural space, the empty building. This is sort of the project. So this is where we started. And then we had, as I said, this long process of workshops and discussions and with invited guests. And we did this in Denmark. And this was people from all over. I mean, chefs showing us how to grow things, hard social scientists from the Niels Bohr Institute talking about the sort of the cosmos, and psychologists talking about empathy, for example. So we're all the way around. And this was extremely inspiring, but in a way, it also frustrated the architects in the end, because there was so much information and so much inspiration, and so much knowledge and so on. And this is the big and very crucial question in making an exhibition, how to transfer or transform all this knowledge and inspiration into a form. Because we were not really talking about water. We were a little bit talking about water, but also the other natural elements and other aspects. But the architects, I sort of invited the people, facilitated the discussions and so, but the architects made the transformation into an actual form. And this, as I just presented to you, included a lot of people, all the guests, and the whole architecture company, which has about 100 people. Of course, not all were involved, but many people were part of these discussions. And actually, they have told me that this process has also completely transformed the architectural studio today, because now they have another way of working and another way of discussing with each other. So this is quite nice, I think.
Yes, I think that what do you give us, I would say, as Northern people, is a sort of positive message, no, about the methodology, no, I would say, the method, no. We can choose one element, air, water, or whatever, and then but what it is very important is that to take care of something does not mean that you have to maintain the things as it is. It means simply that you can work on the transformation, on the concept of transforming things, but at the same time to preserve, no, this idea of beauty, of renovated beauty, through the different epochs, through the different times. No, so, and this is for me as an architect, because of course I'm not an historian, an art historian like you are. I'm more an architect and more. So for me, this is very important, especially considering that now we are in Italy. No, so one of the places with so much monuments and artistic art masterpieces and things like that. So for us, it's very important, and for me also when I was a child, the very difficult things is to imagine the new. Having all this history on my back, no? How to imagine? So I think your work, it's very interesting because at the same time, take together the concept of sustainability, of beauty, and of inclusiveness, no? Of being together. So I think it works very well. It was very precise and very also sharp, no? The way in which you cut all this concept. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I hope that when you be back in September in Venezia, we can meet.
Yes.
I don't know, in Biennale or whatever.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We have an opening reception on September the 3rd at 10:30, and everybody is invited. So please come by. So
thank you very much.
Thank you also, and good luck with your further work.
Thank you very much.
Ciao, Marianne.
And see you in September.
Yes, we will. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.